Ambassador of the United States to Ukraine, Mr. Geoffrey Pyatt. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Great to be with you.
Lots of things to talk to you about, which probably Ayn will
we have some larger questions about the U.S.'s approach to Ukraine, what the solution, what the way forward is, what if Russia's position is changing. But first, to ask another question that we really have to ask. I mean, we've heard that you met with Mr. Kolomoisky. Is there a U.S. position on this? Is this a priority for the U.S. at this point?
Well, Ian, let me put it this way. I'm not going to talk about my private conversations with Governor Kolomoisky, but we have a very strong view on the rule of law in Ukraine. The Maidan Revolution was about building a society which is more just, more democratic, governed by rules. I think there's nobody I know in this country who wants to go back to the days of Yanukovych and the raider attacks, the use of violence to achieve economic objectives, and the idea that there were certain groups or certain individuals who were above the law. So I think the principle that's going to guide the U.S. approach to these issues is, first and foremost, rule of law, transparency, and urging the Ukrainian state to work in a way that's consistent with those objectives.
Why would you meet the governor in the first place? Why would you meet with him?
Again, I'm not going to go into my private conversations with Governor Kolomoisky.
Sure, we're not asking for the content.
He is a governor of a very important oblast at a critical moment in Ukraine's history. The United States is deeply engaged in Dnipropetrovsk. We're working actively in areas like aerospace, work with companies that are down there. So it's quite natural that I would meet with Governor Kolomoisky like I would meet with other major oblast governors.
Have you met with other governors in the past in Ukraine?
Sure. As I travel around, when they come into Kyiv, I've actually give you an example. One I haven't met yet is the new governor of Kharkiv, and we've put the lines out and are hoping very much to see him when he comes through Kyiv when he's got some time. So I mean, very much part of my job or any other diplomat who's here.
I mean, maybe this is too abstract, but it seems like, in diplomacy and countries' relations, we can talk about the investment of one country and another, and interest. Certainly a country like the U.S., which is large, which is active everywhere, at any given time there are countries that are more on the radar and maybe less on the radar. But it seems with, the U.S. giving more money to Ukraine and being more involved in some of the domestic politics, or at least funding some of it, there's a larger investment on the part of the U.S. in Ukraine that we've seen before, maybe a larger interest in some of the policies and the rule of law. Would you agree with that, or how would you evaluate the situation?
I'd put it this way, Ian. We've made a major investment in the success of Ukrainian democracy. We've done so through our diplomacy. We've done so through the financial support that we're giving, 2 loan guarantees now, $1 billion each. And we have worked closely with our European partners to ensure that the voice of the Ukrainian people is heard and that Ukraine is not left alone as it faces this campaign of aggression coming from Russia. But as I've said on many occasions, my view is Ukraine's got 2 wars that it's fighting today. One is the conventional warfare in Donbass, the war of aggression that was started by Russia, and the other one is the war for reform. And I think this whole episode, which was described in your lead-in segment, is a very good example of the issues that have to get worked through if Ukraine is going to be the kind of successful European democracy that the people of Ukraine have clearly signaled they want through both the parliamentary and presidential elections of last year.
Talking about the war, sorry. A year has passed since the annexation of Crimea, and probably, obviously, was the beginning of the war. It started with the annexation. What do you think could be done in this regard? How could the world, the United States and the international community deal with the fact of annexation and with Ukraine winning back Crimea?
Well, I mean, first and foremost, we are never going to acknowledge the illegal annexation of Crimea. That's just a fact of life. It's clear American policy. It's not going to change under any administration. President Obama has made clear that the sanctions which were imposed against Russia in response to the illegal annexation of Crimea are going to remain in place. So we're going to stand foursquare with Ukraine in that regard. To answer your question, how does Ukraine get Crimea back? I think it comes back to the Second War, to make Ukraine as successful as possible in terms of reform, economic progress, deepening of democracy. And eventually you get to the point where the Crimeans are going to say, well, we want to be back on board with that because that's a positive vision of the future that we want to be part of.
And it seems tricky because I know that's a model. I know you don't like comparisons, so this is always hard, but I'll throw it out anyway. Sure. We'll deal with it. I mean, that's a model that has been thrown out with Georgia a lot, right? Where when they're having their own development and going through a boom period of time, where they would say, you know, the Abkhaz and the South Ossetians, you know, once they see how good things are, they'll want to come back. I know there, one of the obstacles when I was traveling is, unfortunately, many of the people didn't have the opportunity to see it directly themselves. You know, we had an episode last week, or a show last week, focusing on propaganda, and when we have this pass system coming into effect, limiting people's movements, and when you have, you know, very polarized media, it can be hard to present an image of that progress. I don't know. It seems hard to go back or to sell people on some of the positives of being in a state, especially as there's an interest for people in breakaway areas and certainly for their backers to move them farther apart. Right,
but we don't accept the premise that what happened in Crimea was a genuine reflection of the will of the Crimean people. It was a bogus election held at the point of a gun. Clearly inconsistent with all of the polling data, even the polling data that Russian groups themselves have acknowledged. So our view on this would be Ukraine needs to focus on making its own Maidan revolution as successful as possible. Let us and the rest of the international community continue to impose a price on Russia for the outrageous act of aggression that was committed during the invasion last February, and then let time do its magic.
Now, turning to the other front, I mean, what's the status of military aid at this point? Because when I have traveled in the East, one of the first, and people ask me where I'm from, and I say I'm American, and the first thing
where are the javelins?
The first thing I get afterwards is like, where are the weapons? Why aren't they coming? Why aren't you supporting us? I don't have any insight into that, but since you're here today, you might have a bit more. I mean, it seems to an extent that this hasn't been something that the Obama administration has wanted. You know, there was an act passed by Congress that enabled them to do this. You know, Obama has said that they're rethinking it, that they're looking at it. Where are we right now with the rethink? Is there, you know, a deadline with that? Are we looking at change? Because it seemed like things slowed down approaching the second Minsk agreement, trying to really go for that peaceful route. Where do we stand?
First and foremost, Ian, we've massively grown our security sector assistance to Ukraine, about $120 million over the past year, up from a program that was less than $10 million when I arrived in this country. Congress has appropriated additional monies in this year's bill. Vice President Biden called President Poroshenko last week about an additional $75 million. So far, non-lethal assistance. You're going to see that rolling out in the next couple of days and weeks. There are going to be some Humvees that are going to be delivered, some armored Humvees that will be delivering in the short term. We've also notified publicly to Congress and now here in Ukraine our intent to move ahead with what I think is a very important training program for the National Guard, which will be conducted out at the training range in Yavoriv. In many ways, that's perhaps one of the most important aspects of what we're going to do in the security sector, because it's about building new software, about building new structures, which again meet the aspirations of the Ukrainian people, move Ukraine towards the European standards that the Ukrainian people have said is their choice through these elections, in which President Poroshenko has clearly signaled he wants to achieve. So we're doing a lot. We're trying to do it as much as possible jointly with our NATO and European partners. It's important that the UK, Canada, Poland, and others are also moving ahead on these training programs. We're delighted at that. And again, as regards the lethal assistance, as you noted, the administration, my government, has made clear we haven't taken anything off the table at this point. It's an active topic of consideration. General Breedlove was in Brussels today talking about the pros and the cons. Sitting here in Kyiv, for me, the fundamental consideration is how do we support the diplomacy? How do we support the Minsk peace plan? Because that's going to be the vehicle to normalize the situation and end this terrible violence that Russia has inflicted on the people of eastern Ukraine.
You know, we travel a lot through the East. We talk to ordinary people, to civilians, to the military, and the main concern is that no one knows when and how and why the ceasefire regime could be broken. There is no obvious reason why it should be broken. Lots of concerns about the possible spring assault. Everyone talks about it. How do you think, and what are the possible reasons why this ceasefire regime could be broken? I know it's just a speculation, but still, what's your opinion on that?
Well, Angelina, a couple things. First, we all need to do everything we can to see that the Minsk agreement sticks. Russia is not doing that at this point. We continue to see Russian heavy equipment moving across the border, tanks, rockets, other armor. Russian military, Russian officers remain on the ground in Donbass, providing tactical command and control. Russia continues to provide intelligence support. There are drone operations over Donbass almost every day. So Russia is not complying with what it promised in the Minsk agreements. So first and foremost, we've got to see that the three initial steps of Minsk are carried forward. The ceasefire, the verified withdrawal of heavy weapons, verified by the OSCE, and OSCE SMM has played a critical role, and the withdrawal of all of these foreign fighters. And that's what's going to set the stage for the larger process. That's what sets the stage for elections. That's what sets the stage for the implementation of the special status that the Rada approved last week, a courageous and important act. But the sine qua non, the single essential requirement, is that Russia stops fueling the fire of conflict in Donbass the way it has done since last summer.
I mean, do you think that the Russians are using this as an opportunity to regroup? Because right after the agreement was concluded, you know, the Ukrainians lost the Baltsova, and there's a lot of reports about equipment still coming through, and this was the experience after the first Minsk agreement. I mean, is that what's happening? Meanwhile, they were also quite critical of this new law giving autonomy to the Ukrainians, to the Donbass.
It's very clear that Russia continues to engage in supply operations. I mentioned the OSCE just a minute ago. It was very interesting. The most recent OSCE SMM report talks about T-72 tanks being sighted in separatist areas. This is a tank that Ukraine doesn't operate in the ATO area, so that only could have come from Russia. The weekly SMM or OSCE report from the border also talks about ambulances being loaded, taking things back into Russia, and it talks about heavily loaded trains moving through the night that nobody can inspect. The border is wide open right now, and Russia is taking advantage of that open border to pour fuel on the fire. That's what has to change.
Now, is there a red line for?
We've already heard from some European politicians and authorities that there's a red line, like starting an offensive against Mariupol, which is a little bit weird. While we had Debaltsevo, so Debaltsevo doesn't count.
Right.
So what do you think? What's the red line?
I agree with you. I think it's, for diplomats, it's very dangerous to get in the business of drawing red lines in one place or another, because then the aggressor is going to just take another chunk of the map. That seems to be happening. Look at what's happened over the past couple of days around Stansia Luhansk and all of that. So we've got to keep an eye on the agreement, which was signed by the Russian government, signed by Zakharchenko and Plotnitsky at Minsk. You asked, you know, what are they going to do? I have no idea. What they keep talking about is they want to acquire at least the entire oblast. That is not consistent with the agreement they signed, and it's certainly something that will entail further costs for Russia to the extent Russia is giving the marching orders at this point.
So what should be done in this case? More sanctions? More?
First principle for the United States is unity with our European partners. It's been critically important over the past year that we have moved forward jointly with the members of the European Union, Canada, Switzerland, and others in the international community. It's had a real impact on Russia and the Russian economy. So we want to maintain that unity. Doesn't mean that we do exactly the same thing at the same time, but it means that we work closely to support each other's diplomacy, to understand each other's analysis, and to advance what is a clear shared objective, reinforcing the principle of territorial integrity, reinforcing the principle that you can't change international borders through force, and reinforcing the principle that it's only the Ukrainian people who get to choose their future. It's not anybody sitting in Moscow or anybody sitting in Washington or Berlin or Brussels. It's people sitting right here in Kyiv and in the rest of Ukraine.
I mean, are you able to say, are there particular partners that President Obama works close with when they're trying to change policy on Ukraine, or there might be a shift? I mean, is it Berlin? Is there clear leaders? Because we had, you know, the ambassador Simon Smith from the UK on recently, and we're talking a bit how, I mean, the UK is never fully marginalized, but we certainly see Germany and France playing a larger role in recent years. I mean, has the US, in terms of Ukraine, worked more closely with those two countries?
I work with every single one of my 28 or 29, counting Ambassador Tombinsky, EU counterparts. And I think our policy is most effective when we're working across a broad front. Clearly, Chancellor Merkel has played a critical leadership role. It's one that we strongly support. Speaking personally, I think it's extraordinary that you have a national leader who's been willing to invest as much time as she has in trying to build a diplomatic off-ramp for President Putin to take to begin de-escalating this crisis. And I think we're all grateful for the role that she's played in that regard. I suspect the people of Donbass are particularly grateful because the shelling and the violence that took place around the airport and every place else is no longer taking place at the same level. But what's happening today is unacceptable. It's certainly unacceptable to my government. I suspect it's also unacceptable to most of the governments of the European Union.
So we've heard from the European leaders and from the representatives of European diplomacy that further sanctions is not an option right now with the current state of affairs. But at the same time, I know I'm repeating myself in this case, but at the same time we have these reports. Yes, we have this growing concern that anything might happen. So there is obviously no step that could, let's say, go one step forward before the other side would start an offensive. I mean, prevent it, rather than not stop it when it happens.
Well, let me start, first of all, by saying I think that the decision which came out of last week's European leaders meeting was an important signal of intent. They made very clear there was unity among all 28 that the sanctions will be maintained until the Minsk agreement is fully implemented. One of the critical points of Minsk is restoration of Ukrainian control over the international border, monitored by the OSCE. So that's a big commitment by our European partners. And of course, we're going to stay in close touch as we assess how much progress Russia has made towards that goal. But I can tell you right now, speaking for the US government, based on our own sources of information, as of today, Russia has made zero progress in terms of the upholding of that provision of Minsk. So they've got a lot of work to do.
All right, well, we'll continue to watch that closely and follow your tweets and all of your updates.
Good talking to you, Ian.
Thank
like
you.
the jacket. I wore blue in your
It's a little similar. I appreciate the colors.
I'm out of this company with my like dress, sorry. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.